want to hear a little bit about why you was invited from this political in Norway, and because I find it a little bit strange, you know. And the next question is, do you think that they did it because they want to change something?
Well, I think it's a few things. I think, first of all, there's a tremendous, in Latin America now, where you had, a few years ago, former presidents beginning to call to break the taboo and for new drug policies. And beginning last year, current presidents, Santos in Colombia, Otto Perez Molina in Guatemala, you know, Mujica in Uruguay, and now some other presidents supporting this. So they're very curious. The ambassadors of Norway in Latin America are very curious about this. So that's the first reason. The second reason, I think, was that Nils, as well as Thorvald Stoltenberg, you know, recommended that I would be a good person to talk about this. And I actually, when I went through this morning, because I've had the opportunity to meet with some of the presidents and high-level cabinet ministers and other influential, so I think they wanted to know. Now, what was interesting, though, is that this is the first foreign ministry ever to invite me. And I think part of that was because of Stoltenberg's role. I mean, he has that respect, and he recommended. I think it's also, though, that the Norwegian foreign ministry people are actually in the international circles and in Vienna, where the UN things happens. The Norwegian representatives have been very good, actually. Maybe even better than Norway's drug policy. So the Norwegian representatives at the UN level are advocating for a much more pragmatic public health policy, and they are in a minority doing that. So I think that was the other variable. You know, there's a level of intelligence and pragmatism in that, at that level, that is impressive. It may also be that, you know, if the Dutch or the Swiss may feel they have their own experts on this Latin America drug thing in their own countries, but in this case, you know, the Norwegians, maybe there's not that same expertise at the intersection of drug policy in Latin America in Norway, and that the expertise that I had to be able to offer. So, you know, but I felt it was a good meeting.
Yeah, but did it give you any feeling that what are they, which way are they thinking? Or,
well, I think,
was it just for learning?
I think it depends. I think there were some people in the foreign ministry who were sympathetic, and some who were more wary. I think that among the ambassadors, some were more sympathetic and some more wary. I think that in a way, I think that my sense is that the highest level of the Norwegian Foreign Ministry is not making a strong policy directive on this, so that the ambassadors and the officials have some flexibility to try to figure out the appropriate action. And I think that in the case of the Norwegian representative in the United Nations in Vienna and those efforts, I think this is a very thoughtful young man who is aware of the science and evidence and aware that the US policy is destructive and hypocritical and counter to the science. So I think there's actually a good group here. You know, so often with governments, what matters is sometimes a small number of people who become motivated, sometimes at the level of the president, sometimes a particular cabinet minister, sometimes a dynamic official at a mid-level range, and they decide to push the envelope as much as their ministry will allow. And so I think, you know, in Norway right now, there's a somewhat positive dynamic. And I think that Thorvald Stoltenberg's role as a former foreign minister and, you know, all the roles he plays and the respect he's held has helped to open this up as well.
And I can tell you that Ethan held a speech at the House of Literature yesterday, and there were some representatives from the health ministry there. They came to me and said, "There you see, we listen to everybody." He actually seemed quite enthusiastic.
Yeah.
That's good news.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. Well, on the level of the user, we are a consuming country as far as drugs go, whereas the Latin Americans are into a greater degree producer countries. But if we agree that the user should not be punished for using or possessing for personal use, then we have how to make drugs available. And if we agree that cannabis should be made available legally for those who want it, what about the other drugs?
Well, it's a great question. You know, one of the things that I said at the ministry this morning, and I said in Latin America and elsewhere, is that I think that over the long term, there are three major policy initiatives that will help to transform the global drug problem. And I start off with the assumption that legalizing cocaine or heroin the way that alcohol or cigarettes is not going to happen. That public opinion has not shifted, that even as support for legalizing marijuana in the United States has increased like this, support for legalizing other drugs has stayed more or less constant. In Latin America, in Europe, the Netherlands, you do not have the support for legalizing. People are too scared, you know, and some of the fears, who knows, they may be legitimate. Nobody knows what would really happen if you made this available the way alcohol and cigarettes are. So I think is that there's really three policies that will change. The first one is the legal regulation of cannabis, right? Because the vast majority of illegal drug users around the world use nothing except cannabis. There's never been an overdose fatality. It's not associated with violent behavior. You know, it's not good to smoke cannabis and drive, but it's much less dangerous than getting drunk and driving. You know, so I think the cannabis legalization, and I think the United States is playing now a leadership role. And if the US can move in that direction, other countries will begin to consider as well. I think the Spanish and the Czechs, there are some other countries in Europe now that are also being innovative. I think secondly, and as I said before, for those people who think there's a slippery slope from cannabis legalization to other drug legalization, I wish the slope were more slippery. It's not. You know, it's very sticky and people make that distinction. I think the second policy is with respect to ending the criminalization of drug use and drug possession of small amounts for your own use. That's where the Portuguese, you know, there is no criminalization now for possession of small amounts. And that's the policy. It's been in place for 11 years. There are good evaluation. And what it basically shows is that the number of users basically did not increase or decrease, but that the overdose fatalities, the hepatitis C, the HIV, the arrests, the criminality, all have declined. Right? And it saves taxpayers money as well, because it costs less to have a public health approach than it has this, right? And I think that that approach is now being embraced in Latin America, where the consuming problem is growing very rapidly. And of course, in many parts of Europe, it's also increasingly that way as well. And in the United States, not so much, but we're moving a little bit. The third policy is really the most radical, but the most essential, which is that for most drugs, like with alcohol, 10% of all alcohol consumers consume 60 or 70% of the alcohol. I don't know if that's true with heroin and cocaine or not. I'm not so sure. You know, but I think it's claimed that. But then a minority of users consume the majority of drugs. It seems to me that what the Swiss began 20 years ago, right, which is to allow people who are addicted to heroin to go to a clinic up to 3 times a day, obtain the heroin either for free or you pay a few dollars or the equivalent. You can get the baseline methadone, you get health service, some help with housing stuff. You know, and then the Germans did it, and the Dutch did it, and then the English did it, the Spanish a little bit, the Canadians a little bit, and now the Danes started without even the research stuff. And it's now national policy in some of these countries. The results show tremendous success, right? Criminality drops, overdose, disease all drop, people's lives start to stabilize, and even some people who have been using heroin for 20 years, you know, 20% of them decide for the first time, enough already. I mean, it's like they, you know, I don't know how many of this describes some of you, but I mean, it's like you know, the heroin becomes less about the heroin and more about the chase, the lifestyle, all of this, and all of a sudden, here's your dream, free heroin. No more chasing, no more figuring out where you get the money, where you score, where you use, how you do it. Here, you can have it, right? And for some people, all of a sudden, it's the first time they kind of go, oh my God, I have my dream. Is that really what I want? And, you know, they're so used to having people force them. Look, what are you doing? You know, punish, you know, get clean. And now there's nobody forcing them. In fact, they're offering them. And for the first time, they go, why am I doing this? And so you have a minority of them saying, enough already. And then there's another group for whom methadone or buprenorphine did not work, but the heroin, they have it, but they still have to go to the clinic 1, 2, 3 times a day. And they don't want to do that. So for the first time, they make the methadone or buprenorphine work, right? So I think that that policy, which has been quite successful, and it's also from the perspective of the everybody, the citizen, the law enforcement likes it because it reduces the black market, it reduces the crime that drug addicts will do to support their habit, and it gives a nod to the public health people. The question is, can you take these programs and increase them in a big enough way so that large numbers of consumers will go and use them? Most consumers don't want to go to a clinic 1, 2, 3 times a day to deal with a doctor to do this. Most of you don't want to, you know, you don't, it's not, some of you may when you get tired of the life, but you don't want to do that. So the question is, but I think ultimately the objective needs to be that for those people who are heavy users or addicts, who are absolutely determined to get this drug, whether it's legal or illegal, it's better for them and their families and the community and the society at large if they can get it from a legal place instead of an illegal place. That's the best way to reduce the demand, the black market. It's the best way to reduce the demand, you know, the power of the gangsters in Latin America and Afghanistan. It's the best way to treat addiction as a health issue. The challenge, however, is the more open you make that system, the harder it is to control. And then what keeps the people who can get the drug from the government from then going out and selling it or doing it that? That's the challenge. But I think in the long term, it's legalization of cannabis, ending the criminalization of drug use and possession, and then providing some form of legal access for those people who are determined to use the drug, whether it's legal or illegal. Those are the 3 ingredients.
Well, this goes for the physically addictive drugs like opioids and so on. What about amphetamines, ecstasy, LSD? Should these be made available in some kind of way?
You know, there's an interesting debate with respect to the hallucinogens, the psychedelics, how to provide legal access. So now, even in my country, the Supreme Court has ruled that with some psychedelics, if it's in a religious use, it's legal. So the Native Americans can use peyote, and now the court has acknowledged the use of ayahuasca as part of the religious Brazilian, Brazilian religion, the UDD, that has ayahuasca as part of its ceremony. There's been similar decisions in some other countries about this. There have not been any decisions about the religious right to cannabis as yet. But the question becomes, how do you allow legal access? It seems to me that with those drugs, which are very difficult to become addicted to. I mean, you really need a will. You need to become addicted to LSD. You have to have a high motivation. It's not easy. Some people manage it, but it's very hard, right? So I would say with those ones, the risk of legal access is less than with the opiates and stuff. I think that with respect to coke and cocaine, I think there the key is, first of all, to take the lower potency versions and to allow those to be legal and sold as legal commodities in international commerce. It is ridiculous. Mate de coca, the coca tea that you get in Bolivia and Peru, that they serve in the US Embassy last time I was there, right, that you use for altitude sickness, it is no more powerful than an espresso. The fact that it is illegal to bring it into my country or your country is absurd. There is no scientific basis for that. You know, Coca-Cola was legal until, Coca-Cola had cocaine in it until 1900, right? To my knowledge, there was no massive Coca-Cola addiction problem in the 1890s, right? Our motto is, put the Coca back in Coca-Cola, right? Allow low-potency cocaine to compete with caffeinated beverages. Because there's no evidence that low-potency cocaine is any more addictive or dangerous, maybe less problematic than caffeinated beverages or other types of stimulants, right? So I would allow the lower potency stimulants to compete with other ones like that.
The real problem is the sugar in the coca.
It's like the sugar, yeah, exactly. I mean, the sugar is the, you know, it's true. With respect to, though, what do you do, you know, about cocaine or, you know, I mean, well, many years ago, I created, when I was still teaching in the university at Princeton, I created a working group of 18 leading academics. Almost all were American, from different disciplines, to think through, Marsha was part of it, to think through an alternative drug policy. And in the end, we asked the question, what would be, this was a theoretical question, right? It would be, what would be the least problematic way to deal with psychoactive drugs? What was the approach that would, on the one hand, reduce the black market, the opportunities for organized crime, the criminal markets, the violence, the corruption, but at the same time, not result in the massive promotion of drugs the way we have with alcohol and cigarettes? What would be the best way to acknowledge the individual's right to consume whatever they want, but also respect the community's right not to have these things marketed, sold, everything like this, right? What would be the best way to balance criminal justice and public health? And the model we suggested, we called it the mail order model, or the right of access model, right? And it was the basic idea. Imagine if, say in my country, there was just one production facility that produced all the drugs. It could be anywhere. It could be in Kansas, it could be in New York, it could be offshore. And anybody, any adult, would have the right, this was even before the internet when we suggested this, but anybody would have the right to order through the phone, email, whatever, a small amount of any drug they wanted. It might not be provided in an injectable form, but it would be provided in some oral form or what have you. And anybody could call up and get a small amount delivered to their home or their hotel room or wherever within 24 hours if you want, right? Now, each state could regulate the public commerce as it wants. So if you lived in Nevada, maybe they would also allow you to buy any drug you want over the counter in stores. If you lived in Mississippi, you could not buy anything anywhere. But wherever you lived, you would have the right to possess this substance and to order it by mail to be delivered to your home, right? Some states could ban all advertising, other states could allow. And it seemed to me that if you had such a system, it would destroy 80 to 90% of the black market. Anybody could get it. Even people who were homeless, right, could get together and they would get a mail order box at the post office to have it delivered. They could pool it. That the only black market that would persist, it would still be for young people because it would be illegal, like it is today with alcohol and cigarettes. You would still have for some people who did not want to wait 24 hours. So like you have places where, you know, you could get it illegally if you need it right, you know. But almost everybody could get it. It would destroy the criminal organization's possibilities. You might ban all marketing, all advertising, all of that. Now, to my mind, that might be the best way. And that would be almost a full legalization model. The opposition is for those people who fear that if you allowed that, a much greater number of people would start to use and become addicted to these drugs. Other people feel, nah, most people won't be interested. And in fact, We already live in a world of widespread drug availability. It won't be that, you know, but I think that was the other way to think about this as a mod.